We're going to continue along with the angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. We said they're also called broadleaf plants generally because of the shape and size of the leaf, and we kind of talked a little bit about the basic leaf anatomy. Now we're going to look at the general flower anatomy and a few details about differences that they have in fertilization and development from the gymnosperms, and then we'll have another lecture we go over some more diversity and differences within the angiosperm. But right now we're just going to focus on the flower itself and just talking about the names of some of the structures and trying to clear up a couple things about the names themselves and then the jobs of the structures. So, starting off here, the flower is growing on a stalk. And that stalk has a name. Typically it's referred to as, stalk is referred to as a peduncle. At the top of the peduncle, sort of the region that then actually attaches to the growth of the flower itself, it widens up a little bit. It's an area called the receptacle. And then the flower will develop. And there are really kind of four parts to the flower. There's the stamen, the carpal, the sepal, and the petals. Right? And so we'll talk about those in turn. So right here, next, as we come up, when a flower starts to develop, the flower bud is protected by typically green leaf-like structures. Right? So they're not typically leaves. They're technically leaves. They're part of the flower itself. And they're called sepals. Now, the one thing I want to, I'll try to use a different color here for some of this, mention is that many of the parts of the flower, if you look them up in a variety of different sources, may have a different name than the name I'm saying, and because it seems like there are multiple names for the exact same structure. So what I'm going to do is try and present to you at first in blue, the main one that we're using in our course, and then here in orange I'll write other names that are typically or commonly used as well at other points in time. All right. So sepal, also referred to sometimes as the calyx. Again, that's it covers the bud and then it opens up and it's like little green leaves that look like they're at the very base of the flower. Then you have the petals. And we'll go into a separate little lecture on the different types of flowers. Generally, we have angiosperms that are called monocots and dicots, and then there are different numbers of petals, typically, that go along with one group or the other. And then there's different vascular arrangements and a variety of other things that we'll kind of talk about the main differences between them. But the petals are one thing you can see in the flowers. And if you count them, you can generally start to group one flower or another. The petals in plants that undergo pollination by insects or birds or some other pollinating animal typically are very brightly colored. We can see these colors, but in addition to that, there are often other colors that are viewed at other wavelengths of light that humans can't see, but that insects can. And so there are some very interesting patterns that can be seen on the petals that attract a variety of different insects and other animals to the flowers to then kind of drink some nectar from them, but then they also will pick up the pollen and then they'll take that pollen and spread it to other flowers. And we'll talk a little bit about that fertilization process here. But in plants that have pollination primarily driven by the wind, where the wind is carrying the pollen, in those particular ones, the flowers, the petals tend to not be as brightly colored. So you see a lot of different types of flowers and different kinds of colors in the petals of the flowers. And there's a purpose for those. It is in pollination, generally. All right, so we have those. Then we start to have the reproductive parts. So we have the male reproductive parts. So these structures here that look like this little stalk with this little oval thing here at the end. All right. So these are called the stamens. And this is the pollen producing structures. at the tip of the stamen, this little structure here is called the anther, which is actually where the pollen is made. And then the sort of stalk of that structure there is called a filament. So the stamen is the overall structure. The anther is really the little structure at the tip. And the filament is this longer stalk-like structure head. So again, stalk is a lot of times used as just sort of a long tube-like extension structure, but then it, depending on the structure it's associated with and its job and all that, then it has a unique or specific name for that particular part. So this one's called the filament. So that's the male reproductive part, and that's where the pollen is produced. So this is the microsporangium, is here where we're going to produce the microspores. It'll produce the pollen, and then the pollen will be kind of like the ones I already talked about in the other lecture. Pollen will have the cells in it. One cell will end up forming the pollen tube, and the other will be the sperm that will do the fertilization. Then we have this structure, much more pronounced structure. Now, some flowers will just have a single structure here. This structure is called the carpal. But sometimes it's called by other names. It's also referred to as the pistil. But we're, again, in blue here, we're labeling it as the carpal. So the carpal is where the ova produce the eggs. So this is the inside here is where we have the mega sporangium. And it's broken down into parts. All right, so at the very tip here, we have a structure called the stigma. So take note here. The stigma is the structure where the pollen will attach. So the little pollen grains, I'll find a little color here I could do this. Okay, so let's say that this is the pollen. Let's label these as pollen. Maybe carried by the wind, in this particular case. The pollen will come to the flower, and then they'll stick here at the stigma, but stay there. The pollen stays there, and then that's where the pollen tube would be produced. So here I'm kind of drawing over here, which we'll get to in just a second. The pollen tube, maybe I'll get a different color so that you can't see the orange here. So that structure would be representing, eventually it's coming all the way down here, and I'm doing opposite colors here, but that would be a pollen tube. That's not part of the flower, that's part of the fertilization process, but this is kind of what these structures are used for. The stigma is sticky and the pollen sticks to it, and it just stays there. All right? So keep in mind, and then the pollen tube develops from the pollen and will grow down, like this, down the structure. The structure it's growing down here is called the style. So that is this structure, this elongated structure here. That's called the style. And it's kind of the place where simply the part of the fertilization process, the pollen tube grows. Goes down into here where you have the ovary, larger structure. And inside the ovary, you have the ovules, which are actually then producing the ova or the eggs that are being produced inside the structures. So this larger structure called the carpal has a stigma, the little tip, the style, this stalkish part, this elongated part, and then this bulbous base. The bulbous base contains the ovary, and which is the whole structure itself, and then the ovules develop inside, and then there can be different ones for different organisms, different species, numbers of them and all, and they will then produce the egg and other things that we'll kind of look at in a second. And those are the main structures. All right, so kind of starting off at the base, our peduncle, receptacle, the sepals, and then the petals. And then you have the male part, the stamen, and then the female part, the carpal. The stamen has the anther and filament, and the carpal has the stigma style ovary and ovules. That's pretty much it. Now, what's going on here is we started to introduce the idea. The pollen. I'm trying to think which color to label this with. All right. The pollen will land on the stigma. One of the cells will then develop into the pollen tube. And so this is the pollen tube now. The pollen tube will extend down the style around here to one of the ovules. This is an ovule here. And then inside the ovule, you're going to have cells that have undergone meiosis. And some of those cells, one of those cells is going to become the ova, or the egg, our unfertilized egg. And then there's going to be this other central cell, which actually has two nuclei in the cell, right? So it's not a 2N cell, but has two separate nuclei. So it's a dinuclei cell. Now, what's going to happen here is something called double fertilization. So this is something unique. That's going to happen in the angiosperms. Doesn't happen in the gymnosperms. The sperm will then divide through meiosis. Sperm is produced through meiosis itself, and then the sperm, there'll be multiple sperm here. Then one of them will fertilize the ova here, and then become the zygote, a 2N zygote. The other sperm will actually fertilize this central cell, and it will produce a 3N cell called the endosperm. So it's not sperm as in the male reproductive haploid cell. That's what we're talking about. This is going to develop into a tissue. The tissue itself is a nutritive tissue. So it's this tissue here, this here. All this tissue surrounding the embryo is called endosperm. And it's nutrition for the embryo, the 2N embryo, which is the new sporophyte plant. Right? And then we have surrounding it, then this tissue here is also 2N tissue. That is going to be the seed coat. So eventually, as we form the seed in the angiosperms, we have a seed coat, we have an endosperm, and then we have the embryo inside that. And we're separately going to talk a little bit about fruits, because many of these plants will produce a fruit that grows from this structure, or grows around the structure, and it's used for distribution of the seeds. And so we'll get into that as a separate thing. This isn't the fruit, this is just the seed itself. So the primary thing is structure of the flower. Secondary little topic is kind of looking at some of those parts and seeing fertilization, and then the unique aspect here that's happening of something called double fertilization, where you have the 1N haploid ova being fertilized, becoming a zygote. In addition to that, you have a fertilization event that fertilizes this central cell to produce a 3N endosperm, which develops into tissue that nourishes the embryo. And that's the main thing we get from here. So after this, we'll kind of look at some of the main differences and characteristics among angiosperms. We'll still look a little bit at fruit structures and the development of wood, so secondary growth. And those will be the main final topics that we'll get into with plants in general and angiosperms in particular.